Hello, fellow travelers, and welcome to episode number 15 of The Apple and the Hero. My name is Sarah Orfali, and today I would like to be your guide on the pathways of history. In the last episode, we came to Scotland to see how this proud nation was able to reclaim its independence and free itself from the overbearing presence of the English. The death of its king had plunged the nation into chaos and opened the door for Edward I, King of England, to submit Scotland to his rule. Living up to his sobriquet, Edward I, Hammer of the Scots, had, through military and diplomatic means, annihilated the resistance of most of the Scottish magnates and had tried to snuff out the fiery spirit of the Scottish people. He had almost succeeded, but from the ashes, two heroes had risen to fight him. One we've already met. He was a landless cadet son of a minor lord, but his charisma, his personality, his burning patriotism made him a magnet for the oppressed. William Wallace gave his entire life for Scotland. He might have scored only one victory in battle, but he became a thorn in Edward I's side with his guerrilla combat style. One single defeat was unfortunately enough to lose Wallace everything he had obtained, but if his contemporaries didn't give him the recognition he deserved, posterity more than made up for it. William Wallace is the hero who started the entire story, and today we're going to meet the one who finished it. In this episode, we'll follow a king, navigating the political situation in a country which had lost its last monarch in an unfortunate accident. We'll see how their experiment in self-government was hijacked by the ambitions of their powerful neighbour, the King of England, who profited from the internal strife between the nobles. We'll march under the Red Lion and square against the English, both in guerrilla-style sorties and in pitched battles. I welcome you, my fellow travellers, on the path of Robert the Bruce. While Alexander the Great had started a new age, the Hellenism, with the way he disseminated the Greek culture in what was effectively half the known world, Robert the Bruce, King of Scotland, first of his name, was very much a man of his time. And so we need to first look at that time if we want to better understand where he came from and his path towards the throne of Scotland. Our story starts with a king, but not good King Robert, as he was later known, but King Alexander III, the last monarch whose death had plunged Scotland into the chaos which would later make possible Robert Bruce's ascension to the throne. We've seen in the last episode the fate that had befallen Alexander III, death because of an accident and his own mulish will. His death had plunged the kingdom into chaos. A brief ray of light had seemed to shine when Queen Yolande announced she was pregnant, but as there's no mention of any child being born, it is assumed that it was unfortunately a stillbirth. The only possible heir was a sickly young maiden, Margaret, who wasn't even on Scottish soil at the time, but in Norway, as she was the child of Eric II, King of Norway, and Margaret, Alexander III's only daughter. She'd been nominated as successor by her grandfather himself in the event that, at his death, there was no male heir. In what is a rare example of the nobility following the deceased king's wishes, the Scottish nobles who had gathered to discuss the future of the kingdom sought to preserve the throne for the right heir. The nobles appointed 6 regents, chosen from the most important and influential families in Scotland, and known as the Guardians of Scotland, to govern the country. Even though the Bruce family controlled a good swathe of land in the south of Scotland, no representative for them was chosen in the Guardians. For this reason, the head of the family started a dispute which would change the course of history. It is at this point that we make the first acquaintance with Robert Bruce, Lord of Annandale. He and John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, had a dispute in Parliament over the succession of young Margaret. Both claimed to have royal blood in their veins, which was true, and that this would make them a better candidate for the throne than a child, and a female one at that. Is this how Robert Bruce became King of Scotland? No. Good King Robert, as he would later be known, would access the throne in a much more spectacular manner. In any case, the Robert Bruce who started the entire debacle is not our future king, but his grandfather, Robert the Bruce V. He would not be the one to realise his family's dream of sitting on the Scottish throne. That would be done by his grandchild, Robert Bruce VII. Yes, unfortunately for us, there is also Robert Bruce VI, son of the former and father of the latter. From now on, Robert Bruce V will be called by his nickname, Robert the Competitor. The dispute might have remained moot, because there was an official heiress, one nominated by the previous king himself, but in September 1290, as she arrived on Scottish soil to take up her throne and marry young Prince Edward, heir to the English throne, Margaret died at age 7, officially from seasickness, possibly from poison. With the last heir to Alexander III's line dead, the race for the throne was completely open. If, up to this point, the Balliol-Bruce dispute had only been an interesting theoretical game, things were now real. Both of them had a shot at the vacant throne. How? As they said, in both their veins ran Alexander III's blood. The deceased king had been the one to inherit the throne as the male heir, but he had also had 3 sisters. Those sisters had gone on to marry English earls, and they'd all produced descendants. John Balliol, Lord of Galloway, was the grandchild of the eldest of Alexander III's sister, while Robert the Competitor was the child of the second one. Also, the youngest had produced a male heir, John Hastings, but he had little support in Scotland and even less interest in the throne. Both John Balliol and Robert the Competitor could claim royal blood in their veins, but who had the most right to sit on the throne? The quarrel soon got complicated and heated. Was a grandchild from the older sister a more direct heir than a child from a younger one? It was clear that the guardians of Scotland were ill-equipped to answer that question. In order to avoid a civil war that was looming on their heads if Balliol and Bruce kept on quarrelling, the guardians looked south and called Edward I, King of England, to arbitrate. Having lost his chance to control Scotland through the marriage of his son to the young Queen of Scotland, the man who would be later known as the Hammer of the Scots wasted no time shoving himself through the crack the guardians had opened in Scotland's door. If he could not put his own blood on the throne, he would rule Scotland through a puppet king of his choice. In order to appear properly fair to all those involved, the matter of succession was open to all the magnates of Scotland. In the end, 13 of them presented their claim. This entire affair became known as the Great Cause. In reality, only 4 of them had a genuine claim to the throne, and only Balliol and Bruce had realistic grounds on which to claim it. Still, it took the 104 auditors appointed for the occasion almost 2 years to select the new king. In the end, the choice fell onto John Balliol, his right to rule recognized through the traditional criterion of primogeniture, inheritance through a line of firstborn sons. Robert the Competitor renounced his claim, passed the title and the estates to his son, and then vanished from the story. The Bruce family would never accept John Balliol as the rightful king, a stance which, for a time, aligned them with England and Edward I. The 4 years between 1292, when King John was crowned and saw fealty to Edward I of England, and 1296, when the Scottish king abdicated, are the so-called years of the empty jacket. History has not been kind to John Balliol. Both his contemporaries and posterity saw him as nothing but a puppet in Edward I's hands. An empty jacket, if you will. Nowadays, historians opt for a little more leniency towards this king. He was a man caught between a rock and a hard place. In this situation, there wasn't much else he could have done. Through a weak king on the Scottish throne, England was having an easy life controlling the Northern Territory. In just 2 years, John Balliol had lost any of the respect his fellow countrymen could have had for him. Edward I had all but sat himself on the throne of Scotland, and Balliol, whether by choice or by force, had let him do it. If at the beginning Edward I had opted for subtlety, now he was all but declaring himself King of Scotland. Things came to a head when he demanded the mobilisation of the Scottish army to defend England. This was the last straw for the Scottish nobles. Deciding that the enemy of their enemy was their friend, in 1295 the Scots turned to France, signing the Old Alliance in the hope of controlling England's aggressive expansion plans. To say that Edward I wasn't pleased with the situation might be an understatement. He mobilised his army and set about making John Balliol and Scotland regret their choices. It is during this military campaign that Edward I earned the sobriquet of Hammer of the Scots. This rebellion ended on April 27, 1296, with the Battle of Dunbar. Chronicles report 10,000 casualties for the Scottish army, which is undoubtedly an exaggeration, but it gives us the scope of Scotland's defeat. After this disaster, Scottish opposition to the English forces was negligible at best. On July the 8th of the same year, King John formally submitted to Edward I, officially resigning his entire kingdom to England. To compound the humiliation, a month and a half later, on August the 28th, Edward I brought to London, to Westminster Abbey, the Stone of Scone, or Stone of Destiny, an artefact on which the kings of Scotland were crowned. Despite numerous attempts to get it back, the Stone of Destiny would remain in England, in the coronation chair at Westminster Abbey until 1996, when it was returned to Scotland and now rests in Edinburgh Castle. As it's still property of the British Crown, the stone has made another reappearance in Westminster Abbey very recently, upon the coronation of King Charles III of Britain. There is a legend saying that the English never got hold of the Stone of Destiny, for it had been hidden by the monks at Scone Palace where it was kept. Historians cannot prove this, but if it were true, this might have been the best victory the Scots had ever scored. What about the Bruce family there? Where were they as Scotland tried to free itself from the English yoke? Since Robert the Competitor had lost the power struggle for the throne in 1292, the Bruce family had been political exiles in Scotland. Their only hope to sit on the Scottish throne rested with the English king, and so between 1295 and 1296, the Bruce family stance was firmly into the English camp. As they considered John Balliol a usurper, their hope was for the English to win the war, and for Edward I to instate a Bruce rather than a Balliol on the throne. And yet, once again, their ambitions were not fulfilled. When, after the Battle of Dunbar, Robert Bruce VI came up to King Edward I and asked him to fulfill the promise made, to put a Bruce on the throne, the King of England famously replied, "Have we nothing else to do but win a kingdom for thee?" This was not what the Bruce family had wanted. As Edward I made plans to rule Scotland directly, Robert Bruce VII, our future king, realised they might have been backing the wrong horse. In the 2 years between 1296 and 1297, our Robert Bruce emerged for the first time on the Scottish political scene. The Bruces had been one of the very few Scottish noble families who had not suffered losses, for they had not participated in the Battle of Dunbar. With the imprisonment of the Comyns, another noble Scottish family, and their allies, there was now space for the Bruces again. It is at this point that the paths of Robert Bruce and William Wallace align. For a time, they would share the same space. They surely knew of each other. They might have even met. Maybe Robert Bruce was the one who knighted William Wallace, but we cannot be historically sure about it. Robert Bruce's first foray in the national cause ended rather badly with what is known as the capitulation of Irvine in 1297. Wallace's victory at Stirling raised morale and hopes, only for them to plummet with his defeat in the Battle of Falkirk. Chronicles from the 15th and the 19th century put Robert the Bruce in the Battle of Falkirk on the side of the English, which is taken as an explanation for the Scottish defeat. In reality, if there even was one Robert Bruce in the battle, a big if, since the role of the battle has no Bruces in it, it might have been Robert Bruce VI, father of the future king. We don't know where young Robert Bruce was, but his actions in this period, mainly the burning down of castles to prevent the English from using them, seemed to put him squarely in the Scottish camp. If Wallace's and Bruce's interests were the same, it was more or less pure coincidence. Wallace was fighting in King John's name, while Bruce was very much opposed to Balliol. In the end, in 1298, Robert Bruce VII and John Comyn the Red took up power in the vacuum left by Wallace's defeat, and were both jointly named Guardians of Scotland. As far as alliances go, this has to be one of the weirdest. The Comyns and the Bruces had been enemies, with the Comyns trying to oust the Bruces at every possible turn. And yet, the two youngest heirs to both families were now sharing the supreme power in Scotland. Robert Bruce's stint as a Guardian of Scotland next to John Comyn lasted about 2 years. In May 1300, he resigned from his position. The reasons for this are not clear. On one hand, the Bruce's territories in the south of Scotland had been occupied by the English, which might explain Robert Bruce's withdrawal from the guardianship. More probably, at least in my opinion, was another reason. Political pressure on the French, and in turn on the papacy, was getting close to get John Balliol reinstated as the rightful king in Scotland. As Bruce and his family had never sworn fealty to Balliol, having considered him a usurper from the start, it might have been that Robert Bruce's political situation was fast becoming untenable. The only logical solution, if Balliol was to come back as king, was to swear fealty to Edward I once again, which Robert Bruce VII did in 1302. His active participation in Edward I's summer campaigns in 1304 seemed to set him up for a reward in Scotland as a valued ally of the English. And yet, not even 2 years later, Robert Bruce would once again abandon his English allies and seize the throne of Scotland for himself. What brought yet another volte-face? 1304 was a pivotal year in Robert Bruce's life. His father had died, and so at the age of 30, Robert Bruce had inherited not just the lands, but also the Bruce's claim to the throne of Scotland. The situation seemed ripe for a change in the leadership, with Balliol's return to Scotland stunted by John Comyn's actions and news of Edward I's illness making the rounds in the realm. Bruce had already started making plans in July 1304, plans which might have involved a possible truce between him and John Comyn. This is not confirmed by historians, but tradition tells us that Comyn agreed to support Bruce's accession to the throne in exchange for all the Bruce's family lands. But then, always according to tradition, John Comyn did not keep his word, prompting Bruce to commit an action which would shake Scotland from the foundations. On February 10, 1306, in the Greyfriars Church at Dumfries, Robert Bruce stabbed John Comyn on the eye halter. According to both Scottish and English traditions, after stabbing Comyn, Robert Bruce reportedly said to his kinsmen, "I think I have killed John the Red Comyn." At this point, his men returned to the church, and when they came out, one of the Bruce's kinsmen is said to have uttered the words, "I mak sicker, I made sure." It's unlikely that the murder was premeditated, and we will never know what really happened between those two men in that church. What we know is that Robert Bruce had killed his political rival in a church, an act which might have costed him everything. What followed was Bruce's immediate excommunication by Pope Clement V, although the future king received absolution from the Bishop of Glasgow. While the murder might not have been planned, what followed certainly was. 6 weeks later, the still excommunicated Robert Bruce was crowned King of the Scots on March 25th, 1306. While posterior chronicles highlight the coronation as Bruce's triumph, in reality he had formidable obstacles to overcome before he could be really accepted as the King of Scotland. Most important of all, he had to convince the Scottish nobles to side with him, a difficult task since they were mostly on the Comyns faction and Robert Bruce had just killed their leader. The new king also had to rid his kingdom of the English invaders. Edward I might have been sick, but he was still well enough to trounce Bruce's army in the Battle of Methven on June 19, 1306. What followed was a series of defeats for the new Scottish king until he was forced to flee the country, possibly to Ireland, while the women in his family were taken hostages and suffered humiliation upon humiliation. Within 3 months of his coronation, Robert Bruce was an outlaw king. It is in this period that the famous legend of Robert Bruce, the Cave and the Spider, belongs. In this story, we find the down-on-his-luck king hiding in a cave. Here he sees a spider trying to weave his web from one side of the cave to the other. Bruce watches it as time and time again the spider fails to weave the web, but after every failure it would start up again. Eventually the spider succeeds, and from that point on it weaves the rest of the web with ease. It is said that Bruce learned a valuable lesson that day in the cave. If at first you don't succeed, try, and try again. And so the outlaw king tried again. In 1307 he planned his return to Scotland. He had perhaps hoped that the gravely ill Edward I might have perished in the meantime, but unfortunately for him, the English king was still holding on. A direct confrontation with the English was out of the question. Bruce didn't have that many men at his disposal. There was only one strategy he could use, one which had been proven very effective against the English by William Wallace himself. Bruce went from outlaw king to guerrilla commander. For a time, his tactics would include surprise attacks, quick retreats, the burning of the enemy lands, and the winning of support through fear. Surprisingly enough, this strategy worked. The support behind Bruce kept steadily growing. The Comyns, who were heavily relying on the English to keep their position in Scotland, started to lose ground. Edward I's death in July 1307 was a major blow for them, as well as for the English interest in Scotland. Edward I's successor, his son Edward II, didn't have the same charisma and military inclination as his father. For the next 3 years, the new English king didn't become personally involved in the Scottish campaigns. This meant that it was now time for Bruce to tackle his enemies within Scotland. In little over a year, King Bruce had forced the Comyns out of their ancestral lands. This didn't mean that Robert Bruce was suddenly free of enemies, but it did give him some breathing room and the chance to strengthen the national and international acceptance of his kingship. From 1311, with Edward II's renewed interest in the Scottish campaigns, the Scots engaged the English once more, still relying on their guerrilla tactics rather than expending time and men in sieges or pitched battles. Between 1313 and 1314, the Scots increased the pace in their military action, collecting one success after the other. And then, in 1314, Robert Bruce suddenly changed tactics. Edward II had announced at the end of 1313 that he would arrive with an army in Scotland by June 1314. Up until that point, the King of Scotland had avoided pitched battles, preferring guerrilla attacks to fight the English. But with more than 13,000 infantry and 3,000 archers coming his way, it seemed as if finally a direct battle was unavoidable. In reality, it had been Robert's brother, Edward Bruce, who'd forced the king into a direct confrontation with the English. Sent to conquer Stirling Castle, Edward Bruce made a peculiar arrangement with the commander of the castle. If by June 24th, 1314, the castle had not been relieved by the English forces, it would be surrendered to Bruce. That was why Edward II had arranged for his army to arrive in Scotland by June. This was why Robert Bruce was forced to confront his enemy directly. History says he wasn't particularly pleased with his brother's idea. Against the 16,000 English soldiers, King Robert could deploy only 7,000 infantry, primarily pikemen, and several hundred light cavalry, whom he kept in reserve. To level the playing field, Bruce decided to use the trees on the battlefield to funnel the English, and dug pits and anti-cavalry ditches. He had also disseminated caltrops all over the road the English would be forced to take. The Scottish king divided his infantry into 4 units, each of them capable of executing the Skiltron, Wallace's pike formation. Also the terrain would help the Scots. The Bannockburn, or stream which the English had to cross, would help slow down their advance, and the marshy, boggy ground would surely hinder their horses and the heavy infantry. As ready as he could be, King Robert waited for the English. On June 24th, 1314, the sun dawned on the most decisive battle in the history of Scotland's independence, the Battle of Bannockburn. The English had come to the battlefield the day before, on June 23rd, and expecting a night raid from the Scots, that night they had rested very little. When the battle really began, the troops were half asleep. As the battle began, the Scots rushed to meet the English, and the former's infantry locked the latter's cavalry into a stalemate, which was broken only by the arrival of Scottish reinforcements. A second clash saw another English cavalry unit engaging the main Scottish force and being rebuffed by them. It is at this point that we see King Robert himself engage in personal combat with an English knight. The encounter ended with Bruce cleaving the knight's head with a battle-axe. When scolded by his commanders, the king could only stare forlornly at his favourite battle-axe, now broken. The first day of the battle ended with a clear Scottish victory. That night, while the Scots were resting, the English moved camp, trying to get out of the bog, and so on the next day they were once again very tired. During the night, an Englishman, Sir Alexander II, had left the English army to seek an audience with Robert Bruce. He told Bruce that the morale of the English army was slow, and if the Scottish king were to attack the following morning, he would surely win. This was all the encouragement the Scots needed. The next day, the Scottish army heard mass, and then the fighting started again. Edward II tried to crush the Scottish infantry with a cavalry attack, but the defensive formations held. And then, Bruce gave the order for a counter-attack. During their initial charge, the English cavalry had avoided the ditches, but as they were being pushed back, the same ditches proved fatal for them. The battle transformed in an all-out rout, with many English soldiers being slaughtered. The English chronicles describe the English defeat at Bannockburn as, and I quote, an evil, miserable and calamitous day for the English. King Edward II not only lost the battle and his foothold into Scotland, but he also lost his dignity and reputation, having lost his shield and privy seal on the battlefield. He had also had to forfeit his court poet, who, in order to save his life, would have to write a poem to detail the Scottish victory. For King Robert, the Battle of Bannockburn was a major victory. His triumph didn't boot out the English from Scotland completely, that would happen only 14 years later, but his victory had cemented his position. Before, he was just a usurper. After Bannockburn, he was a hero. From 1314 until his death, King Robert concentrated his efforts in rebuilding his country and making the English recognise Scotland's independence. To this extent, he started a series of raids in northern England, but it wasn't until 1328, with the Treaty of Edinburgh and Northampton, that Edward II finally recognised Scotland as an independent kingdom and Robert Bruce as its king. Such a result had come after years of diplomatic back and forth between Scotland, England, and the Vatican. Do you remember the words with which I've started the path of William Wallace? It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself. I told you then that they came from a 1320 document. This was a letter the Scottish nobles had sent to the Pope so that he could lift Robert Bruce's excommunication. Since 1306, the king had been excommunicated 3 times, the last of which in 1317, and recognise him as the legitimate king of Scotland. How was it possible that a private letter gained so much recognition as to become something so important as a declaration? Its fame only came about in the 17th century, when an English translation of the Latin text was published. With the text in a more comprehensible language, the contents started to circulate, giving the private missive a new name, the Declaration of Arbroath. According to historians, this is an antiliteram example of the philosophical theory of contractual monarchy, which rests upon the concept of a political contract between the king and the people. The people would submit to the king only if he abided to the specific conditions set at the moment of his ascension to the throne. Considering that it was first theorized at the end of the 17th century, the Declaration of Arbroath is a precursor for this topic. The last years of Robert Bruce's life were dedicated to the reorganization of his kingdom. Most of the administration had been more or less in abeyance since 1296. There was also the problem of securing a royal succession. It was only with his victory at Bannockburn that King Robert was able to free his wife and the other hostages from captivity. Elizabeth de Burgh, King Robert's wife's captivity, had not been completely humiliating. One of Bruce's sisters had been kept in a cage outside the wall of a castle, but she still suffered from ill management. She recovered quickly, for her first 2 children, both girls, were born between 1315 and 1323. Still, only a son could ensure the continuation of the dynasty, but for almost 10 years after Bannockburn, Bruce wasn't blessed with one. And then, on March the 5th, 1324, the Queen gave birth to twins, both boys, David and John. John would die only 3 years later, but David would go on to become king at his father's death. In those last years, Robert Bruce suffered from ill health, to which he succumbed on June 7th, 1329. The cause of death is unknown. The 19th century chronicles talk about leprosy, but given that leprosy is quite easy to recognize and there's no descriptions of it in the 14th century sources and his remains don't present traces of it, it seems a complete invention. King Robert I of Scotland died a fulfilled man. Except for a vow to undertake a crusade, he had realized all his goals in life. He had put the Bruce's family on the throne, he had managed to get England to recognize Scotland's independence, he had obtained national and international acceptance as King of the Scots. His body was embalmed and entombed at Dunfermline Abbey. His heart, as per his wishes, was taken out and given to Sir James Douglas, who should have brought it to the Holy Land to fulfill that promise of a crusade. Unfortunately for Bruce, there were no crusade at the moment, so Douglas decided to take part in Alfonso XI of Castile military campaign against the Moors of Granada. During the opening battle, Douglas and his men were overwhelmed and wiped out. Bruce's heart was recovered and sent back to Scotland, where it was buried at Melrose Abbey. It seemed as if at least one of Robert Bruce's ambition would remain forever unfulfilled. Here we are once again at the end of another path. Robert Bruce's life might not have been very long, but his legacy endures to this day. He stands as a symbol of Scotland's unbreakable spirit. He wasn't alone, though. The people of Scotland had fought and bled and endured years of hardship to finally gain back what they had lost. They were led by 2 heroes, good King Robert and William Braveheart Wallace. it's time for us to leave Scotland. Our next destination is that very same monarchy with which the Scottish people had signed their old alliance. England will unfortunately play once again the part of the enemy as we travel on the path of the Maiden of Orleans. As always, all the research and the writing for this episode has been done by me, Sarah Orfali, Doctor in History. Goodbye for now. Safe travels.